So let's go ahead and let's build Hey Buddy.
Perfect.
Okay. So what did that do? Let's see here. We should get a build successful. Here we go. It says building up top here, and it's continuing to build.
It's a complicated program we wrote here.
Yeah, I mean, I could understand why it takes so damn long.
Hey, there we go.
Build successful. So we run out here. Holy crap, Brian, there's an executable file. And then there's this PDD,
P. Diddy file.
P. Diddy, PDO, whatever. We talk about this later, but this is basically storing debug information. So we just built it. So by building it, I can just double click on the sucker and she runs.
Hey, buddy.
But here's the thing. We don't have, if it's just a console program, just like this, you don't actually have to go through the process of building it and running it. You can actually go to the run menu and you can start with or start without debugging. Now, if you haven't built the project, this will actually build it for you. So if you never built it before, you could just run this. So, Brian, what's the difference between starting with and starting without debugging?
Well, without debugging, it's just going to run almost like release mode.
Mm-hmm.
But if you do it with debugging, what you can do is in your main program file, you can double click to the left of a line of code, and it'll make a little red dot indicator, which is called a breakpoint. So as your program is executing, it'll stop at every one of the breakpoints so that you can take a look at your variables in memory and give you some additional information. So you can kind of help you solve problems without having to write to the console out 5 million times.
We should definitely do an example of that at some point.
Absolutely.
But typically, if you're just kind of getting started here, it runs faster if you do it without debugging. So we'll do that. You'll also see the shortcut key is Control F5. And for those of you guys that are familiar with Visual Studio, this is a clone of Visual Studio. So the shortcut keys are exactly the same. Let's go ahead and run this guy. And what it's going to do is Xamarin Studio, just like Visual Studio, will execute it, and then it will have, the press any key to continue at the bottom. So it's pretty cool.
Very nice. Our first program.
Our first program. Now, before we run away, I'm going to do the typical annoy the Whippet.netters with a Kevin's final thought. I understand that some of our folks out there, I mean, they love Whippet. We appreciate that. But they're like, hey, Kevin, how come you always make us compile stuff from the command line? Well, clearly the answer is because I'm an asshole. Okay? And that's what I'm going to do real quick. And why do I go through this process? Why do I care? Well, because I am a firm believer in bottom-up learning. If you don't know the bottom, you'll never understand the top. So I'm just going to do a quick 101 on how you can take this CS file and how you can compile it through the command line, and then we'll swap over and do some work in Visual Studio. So here's our CS file. So it's pretty simple. We have our same program here. I'm going to open up a command prompt, and we're going to go to C:\Windows, if I can learn how to spell it, and CD Windows, Microsoft.net, and then inside the Microsoft.net folder, you'll see that there's some of the other directories here. We're going to go into the directory called Framework. And then inside the framework directory, you're going to see the different versions of .NET Framework here. With this, we're using 4.0. So let me just space into CD into the 4.0 framework. And then if I do a dir, whoop, there's a lot of stuff in there. You can just take my word for it that there's an executable in here called csc.exe, which stands for C# compiler. So what I'm going to do is I will copy this path because I don't have it in the system path, or I can just put it in the system. I don't want to. I'll just copy this like this. And then let me go to the desktop. Where that file is. So then we'll do that /c csc.exe. And this one is called program.cs. So if I execute that, you'll see the compiler is going to go chugging along, doing its thing. And then here I have program.exe. So when you actually are running Visual Studio and you do your Control F5, you're actually going to be invoking this csc.exe. Now I think it's cool to know that because there are some circumstances where you have to add switches, where you can add them in like Visual Studio, but you can have unsafe code, which we'll talk about later, that you actually have to add unsafe to compile it. Otherwise, the compiler will not compile it. In some cases, I found it more useful to just do it from the command line. But maybe I'm just an old geezer, and that's just how I do things. But here's program.exe and it runs perfectly. So there we go.
Beautiful.